The moment Karim al-Masri's voice fell silent, a cold tension wrapped the room, thick as fog and twice as suffocating. Every executive seated around the vast mahogany table, frozen mid-thought, their pens hovering, eyes locked not on him, but on the small figure at the edge of the room. Rosa Jenkins, the maid they hadn't noticed until she spoke. Her uniform was crisply ironed but plain, the white collar stark against her dark skin, her silver tray still balanced in one hand as she held herself steady, heart racing but face calm, determined not to falter as she repeated her words in Arabic, the same dialect Karim had just used. "Excuse me, Mr. al-Masri, what you said is a linguistic trap. If they sign, they'll lose control of everything." There was a pause, long enough for a dozen glances to exchange across the polished table, then quick enough for shock to sharpen into suspicion. Who was this woman, and why was she interrupting the most powerful man in the room? Rosa felt the heat rising in her neck as Karim's gaze darkened, his brows knitting with quiet fury, his perfectly tailored white robes pristine under the chandelier's glow, his voice cold as he snapped in English, "You speak Arabic? You are a maid, not a negotiator." Before she could reply, a muffled laugh escaped one of the junior analysts at the far end of the table, followed by another. A ripple of amusement at her expense, as if her presence itself were a joke. Their gazes sliding over her like she was invisible again, like she should never have spoken. Someone near the wall raised a smartphone slowly, angling it toward her, recording discreetly but intentionally, capturing not just the moment she had dared to speak, but her humiliation as it unfolded. Ready to be shared, replayed, judged. Rosa's pulse pounded louder than their laughter, but she didn't move, her hands steady even as Karim stepped forward, his voice dripping with disdain. "Security will escort this maid out immediately. We cannot allow such insolence during a critical negotiation." And in that instant, as she looked from the sneering faces to the phone camera trained on her, Rosa made a silent decision. She would not shrink. She would not retreat. She would stand her ground even if every eye in the room dismissed her as nothing more than a uniform, nothing more than a servant. In this room built for men like Karim, with its marble floors, chandeliered ceilings, and heavy leather chairs, her words had already cracked the veneer of their certainty, and no matter how coldly they laughed, no matter how quickly they reached for security, Rosa Jenkins knew the truth. She had spoken first. She had seen the trap, and whether they wanted her there or not, they would hear her before this was done. As the room settled back into its rigid silence, Karim al-Masri's order hung thick in the air, his dark eyes narrowing as he gestured sharply toward the door, already anticipating that no one would challenge him, that the hierarchy of wealth and power was unquestionable, that a woman in a maid's uniform could simply be erased with a word. But across the table, a single voice broke that expectation. Quiet but firm, the kind of voice that carried weight precisely because it did not rush. "Wait," said Robert Malloy, a senior partner whose gray temples and measured manner demanded respect even from Karim. "Perhaps we should hear what she has to say. She spoke clearly, and she may be right." The ripple that followed his words was different now, not laughter but unease, as executives shifted in their chairs, some glancing sideways, others lowering their eyes, uncertain whether it was more dangerous to defend Karim's pride or Malloy's caution, their collective indecision filling the space with a new kind of tension. Rosa could feel the shift, but she stayed perfectly still, her breathing even as she slowly set the silver tray on the nearest credenza. Not because she was surrendering her position, but because she understood that every gesture mattered now, that composure would carry more weight than defiance, that dignity was its own language in this room of cold contracts and colder smiles. Margaret Ellsworth, the hotel's general manager, watched from the far corner, her sharp eyes following every glance, every hesitation, calculating the risks faster than anyone else. And as Kareem's lips tightened in thin displeasure, she stepped forward with the deliberate grace of a woman who had built her authority over decades in rooms just like this one. "Mr. Al-Masri," Margaret said evenly, her voice low but resonant. "Miss Jenkins is indeed a member of our staff, but if she has knowledge that prevents this meeting from proceeding in error, I recommend we pause to confirm her claim. Out of prudence, out of respect for all parties." Kareem's nostrils flared at the suggestion of respect for a maid, but he did not interrupt, though his silence felt colder than any rebuke. His gaze fixed on Rosa, as though daring her to speak again, daring her to break under the weight of the moment. The junior executives who had smirked only moments before now leaned forward with curiosity edged in suspicion, their eyes darting between Kareem, Malloy, Margaret, and Rosa herself, sensing that something unusual was unfolding, that an invisible line of hierarchy had been crossed, and no one knew exactly how to redraw it. Rosa's heart beat heavily in her chest, but her face remained composed, her posture steady, every instinct honed from years of being overlooked telling her to fade, to apologize, to vanish into the shadows. And yet, here she stood, no longer invisible, caught in the spotlight of their disbelief, yet unwilling to step back. And even as Kareem finally spoke again, his voice coated with ice, "Proceed then. Let this maid's interruption be brief so we can return to real business." Rosa knew this was no longer about courtesy or decorum. This was the first crack in the wall that had kept voices like hers locked out for far too long. That evening, long after the boardroom had emptied and the last suits had retreated behind their polished office doors, Rosa Jenkins sat alone in the dimly lit staff locker room, her uniform neatly folded on the bench beside her, her fingers trembling slightly as she replayed every word that had passed between her and Kareem Al-Masri, aware that tomorrow could bring reprimand, dismissal, or worse. The air smelled faintly of bleach and weary sweat, but her mind was fixed on the contract she had glimpsed earlier. The language Kareem had used, the subtle manipulation tucked into his phrasing, clauses designed to sound harmless, yet powerful enough to quietly strip decision-making authority from her employers once signed, turning promises into loopholes with a single line of ambiguous text. Just as she rose to change and retreat home, Margaret Ellsworth appeared at the doorway, her usually severe face softened by something gentler. Curiosity mixed with caution, a quiet acknowledgement of the risk Rosa had taken. Without ceremony, Margaret set a thick folder on the bench beside Rosa's uniform, her voice calm but clear as she spoke. "These are the documents they were reviewing today. I want you to look at them carefully tonight." Rosa's breath caught in her throat, not from fear, but from the weight of what Margaret's gesture meant. Trust, fragile yet profound, extended in the form of those papers. A chance to prove that she wasn't just a momentary interruption, but someone who could see what others had overlooked. Margaret didn't wait for an answer. She simply added, "Come to my office at 9 a.m. We'll talk then," before disappearing as quietly as she had arrived, leaving Rosa alone with a folder that felt heavier than any tray she'd ever carried. At home, in her small Queens apartment filled with the quiet hum of a flickering radiator and the faint scent of chamomile tea, Rosa spread the papers across her kitchen table, her mother's old reading glasses perched on her nose, her fingers running over the fine print with a precision honed long before she put on a maid's uniform. Clause by clause, she traced the legal language back to its roots, recognizing patterns she knew too well from her former life before illness, before caregiving, before the resume gaps that made employers stop seeing her degrees and start seeing only her apron. Hours passed as she marked sections in pencil, sticky notes blooming along the margins like flowers of resistance, each one an anchor against the injustice she could see unfolding if these documents were allowed to pass unchallenged. Outside her window, the city murmured with late-night life, but inside her small kitchen, Rosa's determination crystallized into something harder than fear. Resolve, forged in silence, sharpened by experience, and tempered by years of watching others pretend not to see what she could never ignore. By the time the first hints of dawn brushed pale orange across the sky, Rosa had finished her review, her back aching, her eyes heavy but her mind sharp. She stacked the papers carefully, tucking them back into the folder, as if sealing a promise she intended to keep. As she prepared to return to the Empire Grand, Rosa understood that this was no longer just about proving a point in a meeting. It was about reclaiming her voice, about making visible what they had tried to hide, and in doing so, about showing them all that the woman they had dismissed as invisible could no longer be ignored. At precisely 9 a.m., Rosa stood outside Margaret Ellsworth's office, the folder clutched tightly to her chest, her palms damp despite the crisp air conditioning that whispered down the polished marble hallways. Her reflection in the glass door revealed not just the maid's uniform she still wore, but also the lines of quiet resolve etched into her face. The kind of resolve that came from knowing this meeting would define far more than her employment. When Margaret opened the door, she did so without preamble, stepping aside so Rosa could enter, her expression unreadable but her posture suggesting both anticipation and caution. Rosa sat as instructed, carefully setting the thick folder on the sleek walnut desk, then sliding it forward without saying a word. Margaret's fingers brushed the cover once before she opened it and began flipping through the annotated pages, her eyes narrowing as she absorbed Rosa's neat margin notes, each one a small but potent indictment of the contract's hidden dangers. Ambiguous override clauses disguised as operational flexibility, retroactive adjustment provisions written so broadly they could justify any decision after the fact, ownership structures buried in technical language that would quietly displace the American partners from any true control. Minutes stretched into silence, the hum of the city beyond the tall windows growing louder as Margaret turned page after page, her professional detachment giving way to something Rosa recognized. Quiet fury, tempered but unmistakable, the kind of fury that could transform into action if properly directed. Finally, Margaret closed the folder with deliberate care and met Rosa's gaze directly, her voice low but firm as she said, "You're right. This isn't negotiation. This is manipulation dressed up in legalese." Before Rosa could speak, Margaret reached for her phone and pressed a single button, summoning a senior manager who appeared moments later, his expression tight with curiosity. "Call a meeting with Landstone Holdings and Mr. Al-Masri," she ordered coolly. "Before we move forward, we need clarity, and I want Miss Jenkins present when we discuss these findings." The manager hesitated, his eyes flicking toward Rosa's uniform, his instinct clearly telling him this was irregular, that it challenged every unspoken rule about who belonged in those rooms and who did not. But Margaret's sharp look brooked no argument. "Present," she repeated. "She uncovered this. She will explain it." As the manager left to make the calls, Margaret turned back to Rosa and added, more quietly now, "Whatever happens next, you've done something most wouldn't dare. You've made yourself impossible to ignore." Hours later, Rosa found herself seated once more at the long mahogany table, this time not as a server standing silently at the wall, but as an active participant, the annotated folder in front of her as senior executives from both firms filed in, some glancing at her with faint smirks, others pointedly avoiding her gaze, their discomfort palpable. Karim al-Masri entered last, his face a study in cool detachment, but his eyes dark and sharp as they locked onto Rosa. Without waiting for formalities, he addressed Margaret directly. "I was told this meeting would clarify a staff member's misunderstanding," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "But I see she's been elevated from maid to expert overnight." Margaret didn't rise to the bait. Instead, she gestured calmly toward Rosa and said, "Miss Jenkins has identified several critical clauses that warrant review before this agreement proceeds. She will walk us through her analysis." The silence that followed was thick and oppressive, but Rosa did not shrink from it. She opened the folder, her hands steady, her voice even as she began explaining, not apologizing, not asking permission, simply explaining clause by clause exactly where the language crossed from legitimate caution into predatory ambiguity. Some executives exchanged uneasy glances, some scribbled notes, but others simply listened, their faces blank but their attention undeniable, drawn to the precision of Rosa's insights, to the quiet confidence in her delivery, to the uncomfortable realization that the woman they had dismissed was saving them from themselves. Kareem's expression never changed, but his fingers drummed once, sharply, on the table's surface, the only outward sign that Rosa's words were landing exactly where they needed to land. Not just as corrections, but as a direct challenge to his authority, his assumptions, his control. By the time she finished, Rosa leaned back slightly in her chair, her heart racing but her face calm, her work complete for now. The room remained silent until Robert Malloy finally spoke, his voice gentle but firm. "Well then, I think we have our answer. And I think we owe Miss Jenkins our thanks." Even Kareem, his pride bruised but his calculation undimmed, offered a single curt nod in Rosa's direction before turning his attention back to the folder, his mind already recalibrating, already preparing for a next move. But Rosa knew something had shifted irreversibly. This wasn't just about one contract anymore, it was about presence, about voice, about a woman in a maid's uniform proving to a room of powerful men that no title, no costume, no pretense of hierarchy could silence someone who saw clearly and spoke truthfully. And as she sat there, surrounded by suits and silence, Rosa Jenkins understood that what she had just done was far more than defend a document. She had cracked the foundation they all thought was unshakable. The next morning, Rosa sat once again at the long polished table, but this time the atmosphere had hardened into something colder, heavier, as if every polished surface reflected not confidence, but suspicion. Every glance exchanged between the executives sharp-edged and wary. Margaret Ellsworth stood at the head of the table, composed and authoritative, flanked by Robert Malloy on one side and Kareem Al-Masri on the other, though Kareem's usual air of invincibility was shaded now with something else. Irritation tinged with calculation. In front of each board member lay copies of the revised contract, annotated meticulously by Rosa, every margin note a quiet testament to the hours she'd poured into protecting an agreement they had nearly rushed to sign without understanding the consequences. When Margaret spoke, her voice carried the deliberate calm of someone who knew the stakes intimately. "Before we proceed, we will address the findings Ms. Jenkins uncovered. Her notes reveal patterns of language that not only jeopardize this partnership, but could also expose this institution to long-term vulnerability." Kareem's jaw tightened as he leaned forward, his hands clasped together, as if to contain the impatience in his body. His words were measured but biting. "A maid, with no standing in this room, claims to interpret legal nuance better than our own counsel. Are we seriously entertaining this distraction?" But before Margaret could respond, Rosa's voice emerged, steady and clear, cutting through the coldness like a blade. "I am not your distraction, Mr. Al-Masmari. I'm the reason this agreement hasn't already damaged every party involved." The words stunned the room into a brief but complete silence. Kareem's eyes narrowed further, but Margaret seized the moment, nodding once in approval before turning back to the others. "Miss Jenkins' analysis is not opinion, it's verified, and our compliance officer has confirmed that several of her concerns align with red flags that were quietly dismissed by legal review." Across the table, Warren Phillips, the firm's longtime legal advisor, shifted uncomfortably, his pen tapping rapidly against his notepad, sweat beading at his temple as all eyes began to turn toward him, suspicion now directed inward as much as outward. Rosa kept her gaze steady, her heart pounding, but her expression controlled, her mind replaying every instance in her life when men like Phillips and Kareem had assumed she would stay silent, and savoring now the simple fact that they were wrong. Then Kareem's voice, colder than ever, broke the tension. "If your counsel missed these risks, that's your failure, not mine," he said, glancing pointedly at Phillips. "But I respect clarity. If Miss Jenkins' review holds, we will renegotiate." The concession, coming from him, was almost astonishing. Not an apology, but an acknowledgement that could only be read between the lines. A tacit admission that Rosa had forced his hand without ever raising her voice or leaving her chair. As the meeting adjourned, executives filing out with papers clutched tightly and glances darting between Rosa and Margaret, it was clear that a quiet shift had occurred. Not just in that room, but in the culture that shaped it. Where once Rosa's presence had been invisible, now every step she took was watched, measured, and reconsidered. Later that afternoon, as Rosa walked through the hotel's staff corridor toward the service elevator, her mind still buzzing from the confrontation, she was stopped by Margaret's voice, low and deliberate. "Miss Jenkins, a moment, please." Rosa turned, nerves still taut, uncertain whether she was about to be reprimanded or thanked, her future suspended in a fragile balance that could tip either way. But Margaret's next words settled that balance decisively. "You're no longer on floor duties," she said, handing Rosa a slim envelope. "Effective immediately, you'll be consulting directly with me on contract compliance. Your analysis has not just protected this hotel's interests, it may have saved its reputation." For a long second, Rosa couldn't speak, her breath caught somewhere between relief and disbelief, her hands trembling slightly as she accepted the envelope, its weight light but its meaning profound. Margaret's gaze softened just enough to let warmth through the steel. "You've proven that what matters isn't where you stand in this building," she said quietly, "but what you stand for." As Rosa stepped back onto the elevator, the envelope held tightly against her chest, she felt for the first time in years that the walls around her were not closing in, but opening out. That the future she thought had closed its doors to her might, in fact, still have room for a woman like her. A woman who saw clearly, spoke plainly, and refused to let herself remain unseen. In the days that followed the boardroom confrontation, Rosa Jenkins moved through the marble halls of the Empire Grand Hotel with a quiet dignity that had not existed before. No longer merely a presence on the periphery, but a figure whose very existence now made executives pause, lower their voices, and recalibrate their assumptions. Her uniform remained the same, crisp white blouse, navy skirt, sensible shoes, but where once this attire had rendered her invisible, it now served as a reminder that even those whom the world ignored could hold the keys to its integrity. Each morning she passed staff who nodded with newfound respect, whispered greetings that carried not pity but admiration. Even Carmen, her longtime colleague in housekeeping, now watched Rosa with wide-eyed pride, her voice warm but teasing as she whispered, "Look at you now, honey, carrying a folder instead of a mop, but still showing them all how it's done." Margaret Ellsworth kept her word without fanfare. Rosa was given a modest but proper office on the mezzanine level, a space with a single window overlooking the Hudson, a sturdy desk, and a sleek laptop that seemed almost foreign beneath her hands. But she adapted quickly, her fingers returning to the work she had once done long before her life had changed. Before caregiving, before economic necessity had wrapped her degrees in dust and obscurity. With each document she reviewed, Rosa felt a familiar sharpness return, the clarity of mind that had never really left, but had simply been waiting for permission to re-emerge. But it wasn't only her new title or responsibilities that transformed her experience of the hotel. There were changes she hadn't anticipated, executives who sought her input in meetings, compliance officers who asked her to double-check language before contracts were sent for signature, even Karim Al-Masri himself, whose sharp gaze now carried a guarded respect every time their paths crossed. His acknowledgement was not generous but precise, as if he had calculated that Rosa's expertise was a force to be accounted for, not dismissed, and in that small shift lay the deeper victory she savored. Late one evening, after the last contract review had been submitted and the office lights dimmed to shadows, Rosa sat alone at her desk, staring out at the Hudson's inky waters, her hands resting lightly on a leather-bound folder embossed with her name. Inside it was a formal offer, an invitation from Karim's firm to serve as a senior advisor on future negotiations, with full authority to flag compliance risks before they escalated. It was an offer she never would have imagined receiving even a month earlier. Yet here it was, written plainly, reflecting not charity but recognition, a validation not of her background or connections, but of her ability, her precision, her courage. And as she sat in that quiet moment of reflection, Rosa realized that this elevation was more than personal vindication. It was a signal to every person who had watched her journey unfold: staff, executives, clients, even the doubters who had once raised cameras to record her humiliation. They now saw her as indispensable. The next morning, Margaret met Rosa outside the staff elevator with a slight but genuine smile. "Mr. Al-Masri will be here at noon," she said quietly, "and he has requested that you sit beside him at the table as we finalize the amended contract. Your name will go on the record as a compliance authority." For a heartbeat, Rosa hesitated, overwhelmed by the symbolic weight of that statement, but then she simply nodded, smoothing the front of her uniform and steadying her breath. As she walked into the conference room at exactly 12:01 p.m., she no longer felt like a guest in a space that wasn't hers. She felt like part of it. A woman who had fought her way back from invisibility, not by shouting, not by demanding attention, but by doing the work no one else bothered to do, by seeing what others refused to see, and by standing firm in the face of dismissal. And as Karim Al-Masri gestured toward the chair at his right, the place reserved for his most trusted advisor, Rosa took her seat without hesitation, her heart steady, her mind sharp, her dignity intact. In that moment, the Maid became the authority, and the room knew it. In the weeks that followed, what began as a quiet shift inside a single Manhattan boardroom began to ripple outward, crossing oceans and borders, moving through time zones and cultures, as Karim Al-Masri's corporate empire adopted a new mandate. Every contract, every deal, every negotiation from Dubai to Singapore to Mexico City would now pass through a rigorous integrity review process modeled on Rosa Jenkins' work. At first, the announcement was met with polite skepticism by executives abroad, well-tailored professionals who had built careers on the ability to navigate ambiguous clauses and leverage imprecise language to advantage. But as the first amended agreements began returning from Rosa's desk, stripped of hidden traps and smoothed of cultural misunderstandings, something unexpected happened. Contracts signed under her oversight began closing faster, with fewer disputes, and most remarkably, with fewer costly legal challenges down the road. In Dubai, a long-stalled infrastructure partnership was finalized when Rosa's recommendations clarified terms that local authorities had quietly resisted for months. In Mexico City, indigenous leaders invited to review language around land use found that for the first time their concerns had already been anticipated, not as a gesture of charity, but as an act of respect, written directly into the contract itself. And in each case her name appeared discreetly but unmistakably in the internal records. Compliance Review, R. Jenkins. Back at the Empire Grand Hotel, Margaret Ellsworth observed these developments with quiet pride, her own reputation bolstered by association, but also aware that what Rosa had achieved represented more than improved business processes. It was cultural change. Rosa remained humble, declining interviews and avoiding the spotlight, preferring instead to focus on the work itself, combing through drafts, annotating with precision, and sending back recommendations that reflected both technical rigor and human fairness. Her office, once sparse and formal, slowly accumulated artifacts of this growing global reach. A framed note from a community elder in Oaxaca thanking her for safeguarding water rights. A photograph from a tribal leader in Minnesota standing beside a newly built well. A hand-woven basket sent by a women's cooperative in Ghana whose contract had included provisions for direct payment without intermediaries for the first time. Each artifact was a quiet reminder that the work she did behind a desk in New York was felt by families and communities far beyond those glass walls, felt in clean water, secure land, and preserve dignity. And yet, despite this success, Rosa remained careful. She knew that systems had long memories, that old habits of exploitation could reassert themselves the moment vigilance waned, that power, even when checked, remained capable of finding new paths around accountability. So she built not just a process but a framework. She established protocols that ensured future reviews would include regional auditors, cultural consultants, and independent monitors. She created a reporting structure that required her successors, whoever they might be, to document every adjustment, every clarification, every correction made in the name of fairness. And slowly, with each adjustment, each meeting, each conversation with skeptical executives abroad, Rosa Jenkins' influence solidified into something more lasting than reputation. It became policy. One afternoon, as she reviewed yet another draft from an investment board in Bangkok, Margaret stopped by her office, leaning casually against the doorframe. "You realize what you've done, don't you?" she asked, her smile faint but genuine. Rosa looked up from her notes, tilting her head, unsure of the meaning. "You've written yourself into the architecture of this company," Margaret continued. "They may not say your name out loud in every meeting, but they can't move forward without you, or the standards you've established." Rosa allowed herself a small smile then, a smile that reflected the quiet satisfaction of a life reclaimed on her own terms. A life not defined by what others thought she could do, but by what she had done. And as she turned back to her work, her pen poised once more above the page, Rosa Jenkins understood that the ripple she had started in a single moment of courage had become something far greater than she had imagined. It had become the tide itself. That evening, as the late sun cast long golden stripes across the worn floorboards of her small apartment, Rosa Jenkins sat quietly at her kitchen table, her fingers resting lightly on two objects she had kept close through every step of her journey. A modest brass token engraved with the words, "Voice of Integrity," and a photo of her father, a man who had taught her, long before she ever stepped into a boardroom, that dignity was not a privilege granted by title, but a birthright carried quietly, consistently, often in silence. Outside, New York hummed as it always had, impatient, relentless, But inside, Rosa allowed herself a rare moment of stillness, reflecting not on contracts or clauses, but on the simple fact that she had not disappeared, that even when the world had chosen not to see her, she had kept seeing herself. Her journey had begun with a single act of courage in a room that was never designed to welcome her voice, and yet here she was. Proof that one person's insistence on being heard could bend not only decisions but cultures. That dignity, asserted quietly, could ripple outward until entire systems paused and listened. In the lobby of the Empire Grand Hotel, a plaque now hung discreetly beneath the grand chandelier bearing her name. Not to celebrate her as a hero, but to remind every visitor who passed that sometimes truth comes from the most unexpected places, and that no uniform, no position, no assumption about status should ever obscure the clarity of a voice that speaks for fairness. Rosa thought of the younger staff, maids, kitchen porters, bellhops, who now glanced at her differently when she passed, their eyes reflecting not envy but quiet pride, as if her ascent had subtly shifted what seemed possible for them too. And as she sipped her tea, the radio murmuring softly from the corner, Rosa understood this truth. The work was never finished. Integrity was not a milestone, but a practice, a way of showing up, again and again, even when it was easier to remain silent, even when no one expected you to speak. She looked out over the city skyline, bathed in twilight, and felt a calm resolve settle in her chest. The ripple she had started would continue long after she was gone, because she had embedded it not in personality but in process, not in fame but in policy. So if you feel moved by Rosa's journey, if her courage resonates with something you carry quietly inside, take a moment now to reflect. Whose voice around you is still going unheard? Whose knowledge is waiting to be seen? Whose dignity might need your attention, your respect, your belief? And if this story has touched you, if you see its reflection in your own life, your family, your work, we invite you to share it, comment on it, or simply carry its lesson forward in your next conversation, your next decision, your next quiet act of fairness. Because change begins exactly like this, not with grand speeches or declarations, but with the choice to listen when someone speaks up, even if they were never expected to. And if you've read this far, you already know that voice could come from anywhere, even from someone who, just yesterday, you thought was invisible.